Imagine surviving years of a grueling drug injury, painstakingly piecing your life back together, only to have it all threatened again in a heartbeat. Dennis, a teacher, father, and former benzodiazepine patient, spent years recovering from the debilitating effects of medication withdrawal. And just as he thought he'd overcome the worst, he found himself facing an unexpected setback, one that would push him to the edge once more. In today's conversation, we'll explore Dennis's journey through healing, the hidden triggers that set him back, and the hard-won strategies he used to fight his way through his setback. This is a story of resilience, setbacks, and the courage to keep on going. Hi, I'm Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring. It's my pleasure to be joined by Dennis today. We're going to be exploring the topic of setbacks during protracted withdrawal and recovery. For those of you who do not know what a setback is, it's when you have a temporary increase in symptoms after you've recovered a lot from your protracted withdrawal injury. We usually think of protracted withdrawal injury as a condition that does not get worse. It gradually gets better over time. However, during that period, there can be moments where your symptoms greatly increase. This can be triggered by life stresses. It can be triggered by exposures to drugs. And it can be very demoralizing because healing from protracted withdrawal takes a long time. And then you sort of get these improvements only to see them go away. And it can be devastating, and people can lose hope. And so today we're going to be talking with Dennis, who has been through a setback, and he's going to be sharing his story. So Dennis, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Dennis, catch everyone up on your story, just so we have a bird's eye view of what happened to you.
I got on the drugs back in 2011. I kind of had anxiety throughout my life. At times it was more acute, but I kind of always managed it. But after college, I graduated and went to law school and kind of moved from where I grew up in Massachusetts down to Florida. So went to University of Miami Law School. And when I got down there, I just started having anxiety like I never had before. And it was crippling. I left law school, and, kind of when I came back, so strategies are working, but even later on, I was still having significant anxiety. And, finally, I really was against going on anything like a benzo, just because I knew, I was trying to kind of pursue something academic, and I had this idea that it would probably mess with my cognitive abilities. I had been on Zoloft throughout my life, and I never had a problem with it. But so I finally, throughout that year, went on Klonopin, and initially I felt great, but I could tell right off the bat that my cognitive abilities were just like I used to read a book or two a week, and then I couldn't even read. And kind of over the next 7 years that I was on it, it just got worse and worse. So it's something, I got married. But even working was difficult. I ended up working for my dad's construction company because I just couldn't really think clearly. Everything was hard for me. And then in 2017 in the fall, my daughter was born. And I realized at that moment that something was up, because I just didn't, I knew I was happy, but I just couldn't feel anything. So I kind of started thinking about getting off Klonopin. And unfortunately, I found a psychiatrist who got me off in 2 months after 7 years. So it was a really quick taper, and I got really sick. And so that was, by the time I was done tapering, was about April of 2018. And my head was swollen. I couldn't walk. It was hideous. But somehow by that next August, I was able to start teaching again. And I felt horrible that whole year. Every day was just a nightmare, but I was able to get through it. And the second year was still pretty rough, but it was much better. And then by the time 2020 came around, so 2 years, I was running every day again. My life was, I still had some muscle tension. That was kind of one of my big symptoms. And I still had a little bit of difficult time with stress, but I was pretty healthy by that point. And that's kind of how things were for the next 3 years. But, I kept doing more. So I was teaching full time. And I also ended up being a part-time pastor at a church, and I started doing grad school, and we had another child, and I was handling all of that too. And then around, I guess it was January of 2023. I got a new job as a pastor at a really large church here in South Carolina, and was still kind of adjusting to having a new baby. We bought a new house, renovated a new house. Like everything was just kind of crazy. I was working a lot, so I was out like a few nights a week, 4 nights a week, and just kind of like my ability to handle stress just kept going down. And then by that summer, like I kept pushing and pushing. I probably should have stopped like way before, but by that summer I couldn't hardly even walk anymore. So from there, we didn't know what was going on. I'm like, I kind of thought, well, maybe this is anxiety, but it must be really bad anxiety again. If I feel this bad, I feel this bad again. And finally, last October, we talked to Jennifer Lee, and she was like, "Oh, you can have a setback." And I had no idea they could have a setback. And that kind of started off, before that, we were kind of running around with like our chicken, my wife and I, and my mother was helping. We were kind of running around like chickens with their heads cut off because we just didn't know what to do. But then we finally knew, okay, like this is going to take time. I have to heal again. And so, November I had a little window, and January I had a longer window, February longer, April. So it kind of like, but then I'd have a window, and then I'd be bad again, and then a window and bad again. And then, by the summer it was kind of like instead of being like this huge up and down, it was more like, it was kind of it was a little more tolerable. And then this fall, things have gotten into a place where like, tremendously better, but still some symptoms, and I'm still being really careful until I kind of get back to where I was,
Dennis, how did you understand what was happening to you when you started to get worse all of a sudden?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as someone that had struggled with anxiety over the years, initially it kind of presented like anxiety. I had a more difficult time sleeping. I started worrying about things that I typically don't worry about. So initially I kind of approached it like I would an anxiety disorder. So that kind of meant like going harder. If I felt uncomfortable, kind of keep pushing through. Kind of the whole idea of like, I guess that would be more of an idea of like, if you keep doing something, your brain will be retrained and it won't feel scary anymore, because things just kept getting scarier and feeling really overwhelming to me. So initially, I just thought that it was anxiety.
A lot of sense, like because people do things like exposure therapy for anxiety. They don't want to be controlled by it, so they kind of push and push. It sounds like you were thinking about it in that way.
Yeah, that's how I thought about it initially. And unfortunately, as I kept going down that road, it just kept getting worse. And that was what was getting so confusing about it, is that, it started in January, and by April, even though I had continued to do the exposures and kept doing things, I felt way worse than I had in January. And at that point, my muscles had started to tense up. I started having burning sensations from my head. And by the summer, I just, I would wake up. I never had this before, but I had the akathisia, where I woke up one morning, I was going to go to work, and I just could not stop moving. And at that point, I knew like, okay, this is really bad. And although I didn't really know what was going on. So throughout that summer, we went to a psychiatrist who seemed kind of pretty confused. Tried a couple different therapists who seemed pretty confused. And I just was walking, and I couldn't stop moving. And it was horrifying to me. So it was really just kind of, I guess just seeing that the things that I would do for anxiety didn't work, and I just kept getting worse. And then that kind of combined with my mother and my wife kind of going back into the world of benzos a little bit from 2018 when I had first got off the medication, and just seeing that, oh yeah, people have setbacks. And one of the stories that we saw initially was Matt Samet, who he's a rock climber, writer out in Colorado, but he had a setback after a significant amount of time. And I read his story. I think it was in either Climbing Magazine or Outdoor Magazine. And I was like, this sounds exactly what I'm going through. And that was kind of the beginning of making sense of it.
And Matt Samet is a climber, but he's also a tremendous writer. And if you go on Mad in America, you can see some of his writings about benzodiazepine withdrawal. But Dennis, could you just tell me a little bit more about Matt's story? Did his setback come out of the blue, or was it precipitated by something? I don't know if you know that detail of his story.
Yeah. It sounds very similar to mine. Like Matt I don't want to speak too much for him, but from what I understand, I've spoken to him that, he'd gotten to a place where his symptoms just weren't really a big part of his life anymore. And I think he'd become the editor of climbing magazine. So he's working a lot of hours. And one of the things that he was doing when he was working a lot of hours was he was drinking a lot of caffeine again, and just really going hard, not sleeping well. And I think kind of similar to me, it just kind of caught up over time. Like, he started feeling more stressed, and eventually he woke up and he couldn't really even like walk upstairs anymore. And I think he knew right off the bat that it was a setback. I think he had kind of, one thing that was different between us is I was never part of the community the first time. I didn't find it helpful when I went through my acute. So I wasn't on the chat rooms. I wasn't on the boards. I didn't talk to people about it. So I think he had a little more information than I did, knowing that was a setback. Where I made it worse for another probably 3 or 4 months of trying to still figure out an answer.
Yeah. When I think about setbacks, the way I conceptualize it is you have one of these protracted withdrawal injuries, which I really consider to be a kind of brain injury. Like the neurons are highly sensitive and they're healing. So after you go through the withdrawal, it's like getting a severe concussion or something like that. You've taken a hit to the system, and you just need to take a lot of time for the neurons to heal. But they're still very sensitive. And so I see that people get really, I guess their injury gets triggered again. It could be things like excessive stress in their life. We know that causes, I guess, inflammation in the body. We've got things like insomnia that can also cause problems. Sometimes people get exposed to drugs that have neurological side effects,
Yeah.
and that can trigger it as well, all the way down to things like, I think food plays a role as well. Like whether it's crappy food that's not good, or it's highly processed. And I almost think of it as like it's like a thermometer or something. And the more of these things that you stack on, stress, the poor sleep, the poor food, maybe some drugs, lots of caffeine, nicotine, eventually that will reignite that nervous system injury and trigger off. At least that's how I see it. I mean, does that fit with you and what you've read about this and what you've experienced on your own, Dennis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good way of putting it. I've never really conceptualized it that way, but after my initial withdrawal, one thing that I noticed was that my symptoms would build up. So one of the things that I did, I worked at a private school, and one of the things that we had to do is we go on these trips with 15, 20 kids for a week. And after I came back from that, I didn't eat well. Maybe I had more caffeine than usual. I didn't sleep well. And I come back and, my symptoms, even though I was largely healed, I could tell I had a little bit of symptoms, so it's almost like the thermometer had gone up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So in that stage of my life, I would take time. I would sleep late for a few days. I would really rest. And then after like 4 or 5 days, I'd be back to kind of my baseline again. But one of the mistakes I think that happens is, because it's a different season in life, because, for me, my job had changed, my family structure had changed with another child. So when that thermometer started going up, I didn't have the ability or the time or the wisdom to let it go back down. So when you see that thermometer kind of rise up, and then you start adding, well, I'm tired, so I'm gonna have more caffeine, and then I still need to keep doing this. And then it could just keep going and going, and it really can get to a place like it was much worse than my initial acute, because my acute, like I was taken out pretty quickly. But as soon as I started, like I couldn't work. I was really sick with my acute. This time it was 8 months of just kind of pushing and pushing, and I think that's a really good analogy, the thermometer.
And so, Dennis, when you finally realized what had happened to you, that you were going through a setback, what was your plan to heal during that period?
That's a good question. I think at that point, by the time I realized I was in a setback, I really was pretty hopeless. I had gone through years of it before. I'd gotten better. I felt like, I had gotten my life to a place that was better than it was, even before I had taken Klonopin. So I didn't know, like, I really, there was not a part of me, a year ago that thought I would heal. I really, like, my plan was like, if you'd asked me, I'm just like, there's no way I'm going to get better. That's how bad I felt, you know? So I think that initially it was just my mother and my wife and some really good friends that actually took the time to learn about this. And they would just, they would play me, you know, different people speaking, you know, even some of your videos I've watched, and just people get better, people get better. So in the first few months, it was really just like my family was fighting for me. Um, and then by, you know, January and February, March, when I started to see some hope, you know, my plan was kind of like, I'm going to give it some time. I'm gonna get to a place where I can kind of struggle through, work again, like I did when I first got off Klonopin. So my thought was, I just need to get back to a place where I'm uncomfortable, but I can get up early. I can go to work and function all day. But then, you know, I would feel better, and I'd try to go sub school for a day, and I'd feel horrible again. So my plan had to change again. And then, so this is a long answer, but I think by summer, I finally had a plan that I was going to incrementally add to my life. I was going to dip my toe in the water and see how it was. And then once something started to feel comfortable, I'd add something else. So what that looks like is, you know, in the beginning, it would be maybe go and hang out with friends for an hour, and then I'd come back and rest. And then after doing that for a while, maybe it looked like hanging out with friends for an hour, then taking my kids to school. And then maybe it looked like adding in a part-time job, and then adding in going back to, you know, our church community, and going back to walking. And so it's really been an evolving plan to get better. I don't think I had a plan in the beginning. My plan was just to hold on and make it through.
And I think, I mean, that's a really good point. When this happens to you, a lot of the folks I talk to who go into these setbacks are in such distress. I mean, like you said, intense anxiety, just pacing around. On top of that, your life, which you've fought to rebuild, is now falling apart. I mean, you're working, you're doing things, you have responsibilities. You're watching everything that you've struggled so hard for over the last couple of years fall apart in front of you.
Right.
And so that's really chaotic. But what I do want to highlight is, it sounds like you, and this may not have been a choice. You may have felt like you were forced, but you had to pull back from your stresses and your responsibilities for a period of time to let things cool off before, like you said, adding them back in gradually.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still at that place now. I mean, there's been at this place, I'm not back to teaching in person all day. I teach virtually. I've been able to pick up, kind of jobs writing for different outlets. And I've been able to, kind of be part of all my friendships again, be a part of different communities we were part of before. But even now, I mean, a year later, or I guess a year and 2 months later, 3 months later, I guess now it's getting, each month keeps going. But even now, I'm still kind of dipping my toe in the water and seeing, okay, I really want to go back to full-time work. I have 2 young children. I'm 38. It's really been very inconvenient not to be able to work full time. So, that's something I really keep trying to test, but I don't want to go. The last thing I want to happen at this point is to go back full speed and then get sick again. So I'm trying to really just kind of titrate it up a little bit each time. And it's been working for me. Each month I've added in more, and I've been able to handle more.
And I know some people get really into this during their recovery and others don't. And I see both groups heal. But I wanted to get your perspective on what you think about things like caffeine, nicotine, diet during recovery from a setback. Was that something that you were consciously looking at?
Yeah.
Or was it something that didn't play as much of a role for you in your healing?
Yeah. So one thing that, one thing I started years ago was drinking decaf coffee, just because during my initial withdrawal, like the Klonopin had made me so fatigued all the time that, like, at that point in my life, I was relying on like all kinds of stimulants. Like I was not illegal stimulants, but I was just drinking tons of coffee. I was chewing tobacco. So nicotine, like there was all these things that I was just like using to keep me, to give me some energy. So when I first got off the medication, I kept like I was still chewing tobacco. I was still drinking regular caffeine, and I healed doing that. 'Cause I think it would have been harder for me to rip those away because my body had become so used to it. As I had healed, I got rid of, I stopped chewing tobacco. I started drinking decaf. Um, and then eventually I cut out sugar too, because I realized if I had sugar, I still felt a little more triggered and uncomfortable. So going into the setback, I'd already
What I'll
made a lot
say
of
about
damage.
the sugar that's really interesting is if you're having a lot of added sugars in your meals, it actually triggers adrenaline in your body
Mm,
because as the blood sugar rises, you get this big wave of insulin that kind of crashes your blood sugar back down in response. And then adrenaline kicks in to kind of raise the
mm,
sugars back up to a good level. And a lot of people overshoot, especially when they're eating too much sugar. And there's lots of research out there that
yeah.
shows high sugar diets, um, people have high levels of adrenaline and consequently more anxiety. And so
Hmm.
that would make a lot of sense that intervention was helpful for you.
Yeah, it was really helpful. I mean, after a couple of years in my initial withdrawal, after getting rid of caffeine, even though there's some caffeine in decaf, and I still drink that. Once I did that and cut out the sugar, like I was so much healthier quickly. That was the biggest change. In this setback, one of the things that I did was I was drinking, even though I was drinking decaf during my setback, I was drinking like tons of decaf. Like, I transitioned to a role of kind of like as a pastor. So I was at a lot of coffee shops, hanging out with people. So I was just drinking decaf coffee all day. And I think that part of that too, the accumulation of decaf over time, because there's still some caffeine, I think it triggers some symptoms too. Um,
Yeah.
so during the setback, I haven't had sugar. My diet hasn't been that clean though. That's one thing that I've been trying to slowly clean up, but I could do much better with that. But my diet really hasn't been that great.
Yeah. And I've talked to a lot of people and I think all of the things that help in a setback may also be things that generally just help with good mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I see always is uh, kids who may have had some anxiety or maybe a little bit of depression when they were in high school, they go away to college. And you know what happens when you go to college? You start drinking more. And so, your sleep gets impaired. Sometimes the food is pretty poor quality. I mean, I remember eating lots of McDonald's and ramen and terrible things
Yeah.
when I was at college. And um, yeah, late nights, all of that kind of stuff. And so you're just exposed to all of these inflammatory things. And so I see college kids, a lot of them, they'll have their first presentation of, I guess, a serious mental health problem when they leave school and go there. Oh, so they're away from their families. But I really
Right.
do think those things play a role, like lots of caffeine, diet, and all of these things can kind of tip someone over. And so um, to the extent that you can, and obviously having compassion for people in setbacks,
Yeah.
sometimes you can't do all of these things, but you kind
Mm-hmm.
of do what you can, wanting to just, I guess, bring down the level of inflammation, the level of stress and adrenaline in your life to put your brain and your body into a place of healing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's something that, I think one of the things I've been trying to articulate is just that, for me, the setback has been an evolving game plan. So I think, after a year where I'm able to do things and function much better, at this point, I can make much better choices about eating. Whereas a year ago, I was trying to survive and, it was hard to eat in general. So like I might have a hot dog or a cheeseburger and that'd be all I had all day. So that's one thing too. It's just, there's different levels of setbacks. There's different seasons of setbacks. When you're really acute, I think sometimes it's hard to really grab onto some of the really healthy things you can do to help yourself. But as you get better, I think it's really important to, really start trying to do whatever you can do to bring that nervous system down to, do healthy practices. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. And you're spot on. Everyone's journey with this, I see, is very unique because you wouldn't tell someone who's just entered a setback, oh, you need to go out and get some exercise, because
Right.
that might be absolutely impossible and painful for some people. You may
Yeah.
need an intervention like, hey, can you go and sit out in the sun a little bit today? I mean, that might be your first foray into kind of doing something healthy, and you just find these like little steps to do which are manageable. Like you said
Yeah.
before, I would go out and see friends, when I was ready, and then gradually building up to work and such. I think that's a really good way to look at it.
Yeah. And initially, I mean, like a year ago, I mean, I was really bad, but by November, each day at that point, I kind of was like, I'm going to do what I can each day. So last November, we live in South Carolina, where it's not like a crazy fall, but there, it's fall here. The seasons change. So I would go out and rake leaves. Sometimes, it was 5 minutes. Sometimes it was 10 minutes. Some days I couldn't do it, but I would try to gently push myself. Inevitably I would push myself too much different times in the week, and then have like a little bit of, have a few days or a week where I didn't feel good. But I do think that was, for me at least, that was helpful because I could see progress. Like one of the things that some people do, and maybe that's all they can do, and I want to have compassion for that, is that it's almost like you just wait for your symptoms to go away to re-enter life. And for me at least, it was helpful to be able to do what I could each day, and then see over the months that what I could do each day is actually more than I could do a month ago or 2 months ago. And that was really the basis of the hope I had, was that things were changing.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a message for someone who's maybe in that first month or two of having a setback, who maybe hasn't seen any improvement so far? Um, Maybe a message, but also if you could talk about what that headspace is, to land there, and just how challenging it can be.
Yeah. I mean, like my experience with mental health has been around the anxiety. But when this happened, it was a depression that, I don't know, it's hard to even put words to it. Like, I have two beautiful kids. I would look at my kids and I would just start crying. Yeah, I would look at my wife. I would start crying. I'd go outside, and like everything was just like the things I had lost at that point. That's literally all I could think about, was everything I've lost and how I'll never get back, and the thought process was, I'm 38. I have maybe, if I live to normal age, I have maybe 40, 50 years left of this, and I can't do it. So, um, yeah, I don't think, I don't know. It's hard to even, like, in that state, it's hard to even have advice. I really think at that point that you need people to fight for you. And unfortunately, one of the saddest things I've seen in this process is that people lose loved ones, like whether it's their husband or their wife or friends. Um, they just don't have the support that I had. And so the first message I would give is that, so anyone that's listening, that's a support person or that's a friend, like, you could be the difference between whether someone makes it or, they completely lose hope. So that's the first thing I would say. But then the second thing I would say is that, eventually I started finding people who had been through it before. And one of the things that's most encouraging about it is, no matter who you talk to, I can talk to someone like Nicole Lamberson, who has been sick for a lot of years. You talk to people that have been sick for 2 years. Everyone gets better. And that needs to be the message. That needs to be the hope. I'm not saying that some people that don't maybe have some lingering small symptoms, but people get their lives back. And even if, eventually my friend, one of my really good friends in this, my neighbor, he was one of the few people that I was able to spend a lot of time with. Like, it didn't trigger me. He was like, really, if this takes 2 years of your life, that's still a small amount of, whole lifetime. So just kind of gaining some perspective on that it will get better, that, if this takes 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, that's still, it's painful, but it's not your whole life. And, one of the things that I'm seeing is, as I'm getting better, is I'm changing in a lot of ways. I'm more patient than I was before this happened. I think I definitely value my family. I mean, I did before, but I'm able to be like, okay, there's some things that are the most important, and that's my family. I'm not willing to do a job or anything that's going to, like, make my health to the point where I can't interact with them again. So that's what I would say. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I know you mentioned, I was wondering if you could talk more about, maybe your perspective on self-care. having had a setback now, how is that changed for you? When you look forward to how you're going to look after yourself, work, stress,
Mhm.
all of that. What new perspectives do you have having gone through this slash still going through it?
Yeah. I think I came out of my initial withdrawal with this idea that, the time that I was on Klonopin and the time that I was sick were lost years, and I'm going to make up for that. And it made me even more ambitious than I already was, and it made me push myself harder than I'd ever had. And I've had to learn the hard way, but that's not a good perspective to enter life with. Um, and I think one of the things you take when you have things taken away, you appreciate things more after. So now, my idea now is, I hope that as I get healthier and healthier, I hope to really hang on to this, is that, I need to listen to my body. Like my life needs to be run by my capacity that my body's showing me rather than what I just want to do. So I might want to go, work all day and then go do exercise and then go out. I might want to do that, but if my body's telling me that it's fatigued and it's overwhelmed, like, I'm going to rest, So my perspective now, I think, towards self-care is it's much more led by my body than just my desire to what I want to do. It's more realistic. And I think one of the challenges has been embracing limits that we all have. I mean, some people have high capacity, some have low capacities, and just kind of finding out what that is and taking care and living in that capacity is kind of my plan for the future.
Yeah. Well, Dennis, I can't think of additional questions for you at this time, but I want to ask, is there something I didn't ask you about which you think is important to share for people wanting to learn about setbacks before we wrap?
Yeah. I mean, so one thing that was helpful to me, and this is kind of, I want to say this, but I also want to be careful because not everyone can afford this. One of the things that was really helpful for me was that I was able to work with people that had been through this, that were experts. I worked with the guy, Chris Page, who I know has been on your show, worked with him weekly. And, he was able to give me some context what I was going through. I've spoken with Baylissa, not as much as Chris, but Baylissa probably 3 times. My mother actually reached out to her and things are really bad because she's like, what's going on here? And I think she was just soothed by her, she's going to get better. And, Nicole Lamberson I've talked to. So, I mean, if you can, and if you have the resources, reaching out to someone that's either a coach or someone but if you don't have the resources, there's people that have been through it that will talk to you. So that's the first thing, finding people that are either healing, like fairly healed or healed to talk to, and to have them give you hope and kind of help you see the light at the end of the tunnel. And the second thing is just, and I've heard this, I think a lot of people will say this, but like, do not spend all your time on the Facebook or the boards of, it really is like a race to the bottom of like how scared you can be and how triggered you can be. And, to ask a question about your health to a bunch of other people whose anxiety is at a 10 is not going to make your anxiety go down. It's going to bring up new fears you hadn't already thought of. Like I remember I did it once and I asked a question and the response was like, literally, I'm like, oh man, that's a whole new fear I haven't even considered, So I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore. So finding people to talk to that have been through it, whether that's a coach that you could, pay, or someone that, of that's been through it and is healing or healed. And also just avoiding talking to other people that are as bad as you that will scare you. And, there's a place for community, and I'm sure that some people found that helpful, but for me, I found it scary.
Mm-hmm. Dennis, thank you for coming on and talking about this experience. This is a really important topic to a lot of people who are suffering right now. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I'm glad that I really hope people will learn more about setbacks and the possibility and be careful. I appreciate having me on.
If you're interested in learning more about protracted benzodiazepine withdrawal, we recommend you watch this video next.